Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa-salatu wa-salamu ala ashraf al-anbiya wal-mursaleen wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like just to ask first off, how many people are Muslims in here? Are Muslims, practicing Muslims? I don't want to embarrass some people or something. So the majority are, I'm taking it, which I find it a little difficult only because I like to keep focused at a level that everybody's going to understand. And so since there are some people that are not practicing Muslims, I'll try to minimize the use of vocabulary that is common coin amongst the Muslims. And then for those who saw a tape, I guess I heard that there was a video from ISNA, and I made an excuse that I hadn't had any sleep, and I'm going to use that same excuse today because, in fact, I actually got off a plane from Jeddah and then got on a plane with a short interval of a day to Canada. So I was in Mecca and Medina during Ramadan. And actually the reason I'm here in the States is because I was invited here. And the people in Mecca thought I was insane when I told them that I had to go because I had a talk in Toronto, Canada. They said, how can you leave the Kaaba for a talk in Toronto, Canada? And I said, well, I made the commitment before I actually knew I was going to be in Mecca during that blessed time. So I'm keeping my commitment here. So due to this jet lag, and I also feel like I'm at about 37,000 feet right now. So if I talk over your heads, it's only because of that experience. About the topic, a call to da'wah. If you look, I think my experience has been, I've done a lot of traveling. My experience has been, really to sum it up, a sociologist at Berkeley, who's been there for several years, told me not too long ago that for about 30 years he was an atheist. And just recently he had come to realize that there is a God. This was what he said. And he said, but what shocked him was that it wasn't only his realization, but really something that he felt that was taking place all over the world. And I think right now, in the sense that while we see intense darkness in the world, I think there's also these beacons of light that are emanating out from different corners on the earth. And I think it's not simply the Muslims that are rediscovering their faith, but I think it's happening in many regions on the earth. And I don't think that the reason that this is happening is something that can be reduced to materialistic explanation, which is generally how certainly Western analysts like to interpret these things. They like to say that the reason that there's a resurgence of Islam in the Muslim world is due to the fact that there's geopolitical situations there that are ripe for the situation to come about. People tend to find simplistic answers in religion. When times get complicated, people tend to look towards religion for answers. And I don't think it can be reduced to that simple of a formula for interpreting it. What I would say, though, is that we have seen in our lifetimes things and events, really, that have been phenomenal. Anybody that's over 30 years of age has seen extraordinary changes in human society. People that are around 70 or 80 or 90 years old have seen unbelievable changes, things that really are unimaginable if they hadn't seen them. If you look at this century alone, one of the great arguments against religion is that all the wars that humans have fought have been so-called quote-unquote religious wars. And yet, if we look at all these so-called religious wars, we'll find that, in fact, the amount of people that died in those religious wars is minuscule compared to the amount of people that have died in this century alone due to such ideologies as communism and democracy. We have seen in this century over 180 million people killed through technological means. 180 million people. And really that's a conservative estimate. We've seen in our lifetime hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, killed. Many of us have seen it on television. And the most recent example certainly was the Gulf War and now Bosnia and Herzegovina. And these are only the ones that get news coverage. There's things going on in Burma, there's things going on in the Philippines, there's things going on in Kashmir, in Africa, in many different areas in Africa that don't have the benefit, if we can call it a benefit, of getting news coverage or concern. And I think there's a deep sense amongst a lot of people that these are extremely unusual times, that they're times of great events. What we've witnessed really with the destruction of sovereign states in the last few years, and I think the dismantling is going to continue. It's not completely intact because the apparatus whereby it would create basically a one-world situation is not fully intact, but it's moving, and it's been moving for some time towards that direction. So while all of this is happening, while all of these people have been killed, while all of these wars have taken place, there's this deep sense, right, of despair in many places. There's also a deep sense of cynicism in many places. And I think from that environment, there's a need for answers. There's a need for light. Because the human being, by his nature, or by her nature, is unable to exist in a void. People have to have meaning. If we look at the 19th century, and really what happened to religion, how religion was dismantled from the lives of people, because it's something that actually we can see the progress that took place. In the 19th century, we had the Industrial Revolution in the West and had massive changes that began to take place. But within the intellectual atmosphere, what was happening was there was a deep analysis, really, of traditional religious texts in a field that was called philology. And what these people began to discover was that these texts were in fact, there was a great deal of mythology, for instance, in the Old and New Testament. There were a lot of things that could be traced back to roots that were alien to the basic and fundamental claims of those books themselves. And this led to really a sense of it basically destroyed Christianity, is what it did. It took some time, right? But what these intellectuals really kind of worked out was that what we're dealing with is in the Old Testament a very parochial book or a provincial book whereby there's this tribal deity that goes around destroying anybody that opposes these 12 tribes in the midst of the deserts of Egypt and what's now present-day Israel. And then you move to the New Testament, which has a little more of a universal flavor. It's a little easier to swallow than the Old Testament. But it's got all this metaphysical fiction. And so these people looked at this, and then at the same time while this was going on, this critical analysis of these texts, and it was beginning to seep down into the centers of learning, at the same time there were remarkable transformations taking place in the social sciences. Darwin's theory was really a justification for colonialism, because racism ultimately is a way that the people that exploit are able to, in a sense, justify their exploitation. It's nothing other than that. Racism is not about color. It's not about ethnic background. what it is about exploiters need a justification for exploiting the people that they're exploiting, or for feeling good about it. So if we look at people that we tyrannize and terrorize and say these people are really, they're not fully human, their frontal lobes aren't as developed as ours, they're really only useful for bondage or slavery, like Aristotle had his peoples that were naturally inclined towards bondage. And so the whole Darwinian picture really justified the Europeans going into Africa, into the Middle Eastern countries, into India and Asia, and made them really feel okay about being Christian and about doing all these things to these people in these places. So you had that taking place. And then you had communism. You had a materialistic explanation of class tension, of struggles within societies, basically being about bread and about food and about basic primary needs. And then as religion is losing its foot in the European psyche, what develops out of that really is what Nietzsche termed nihilism, or a void, really. And what Nietzsche said is once we eliminate God as an absolute value from the picture, all other values automatically disappear, you see. Because if I don't believe in a hisab, in an account, in a reckoning, if I don't believe that there's a moral authority outside of myself that imposes upon me moral imperatives, then really nobody can impose anything upon me. If there's nothing absolute, if things are relative in their nature, then nobody can tell me what to do or what to say. If, for instance, as a humanist, I choose not to kill, this is a hypothetical imperative. I choose not to kill. Somebody else down the road can say, I choose to kill. Right? And this happens. Well, why did you kill him? Well, it was Monday. I don't like Mondays. Somebody actually said that. They killed somebody went and shot a bunch of children in California, I think. And they asked them why they did it. Well, it was Monday. I don't like Mondays. You see, and that is really, you're getting into deep nihilism there, where there's nothing there. It's just a void. So if I've watched The Predator 50 times, which I think that person did, I haven't seen it one time, but I'm supposing it's some gruesome movie about a guy that goes around shooting people and kind of feeling good about it, right? And so this person had watched this program 50 times or something and then went out and did it, right? And then people say, well, there's no scientific evidence that watching television has any effect on the behavior of people. We've done several studies and there's no proof, right? So the point of all that is suddenly Europe's without any moral foundation or base, as if they ever had one. There's an argument that they didn't. Because if you look at what they did, like Ralph Waldo Emerson said, I can't hear what you're saying because your actions are shouting so loudly. Right, so while the Europeans have always told us about, and these are my grandparents I'm talking about now, the Europeans have always told us about democracy and Rousseau's rights of man and all these wonderful concepts, right? The fact of the matter is Europe seems to be kind of a leukemia on the social body. Or leukemia is too, that's a nice disease. It's more like a malignant growth, right? The kind of wherever it goes, it just eats people up, right? I mean, leukemia, you kind of get withered and just kind of fade away. Malignancies just get bigger and bigger until they kill everybody, right? And so there is an argument, but I would tend to say that there was at one time some moral base. To give you an example, the Pope actually once declared using crossbows as cruel and barbaric warfare. Therefore, it can only be used on the Muslims, right? Not on Christians, because it was cruel and barbaric to use it on Christians. Let's find another way to kill Christians that's less cruel and less barbaric, like swords and things like that. Whereas Muslims, since they're cruel and barbaric, let's use cruel and barbaric weapons to wipe out the Muslims. So there was some moral base. It didn't have a real strong foundation, but it was there. Now it's not there anymore. Now if you look at the Muslim countries, right, don't. If you haven't, don't. Especially if you're not Muslim. Just ignore them, pretend they don't exist, and read about Islam. If you're from these unfortunate places, then if you do look at them, basically what we're dealing with is people that also, unlike Christianity, that all of a sudden realized they had a made-up religion, right? I mean, that's what they realized, that it was made up. And so now that's how you can get these guys that say, I've got a prayer cloth here, if you send $50, you'll get your prayers answered, because I swear it on the Bible. And people send in $50. And that's what Christianity's been reduced to, you see. They don't have anything other than that. It's in a superstitious phase because it's philosophical, and it's the philosophical and spiritual content of Christianity was basically destroyed during it really starts post-Renaissance, but it heats up 17th, 18th, and 19th century, finishes it off. That did not happen to Islam. What happened to Islam was in some ways more devastating, and in some ways not. It was not more devastating in the sense that Islam itself never lost the power of the truth of Islam amongst the Muslims. What happened was the Muslims were defeated militarily. And that created such a massive crisis in the Muslim psyche. And the reason for that is simply stated, the Quran promises victory. It's actually a promise. I mean, the Quran talks about, and the Hadith talks about the nature of the war between truth and falsehood. That there are days that the truth has its day, and then there are days where falsehood has its day, but ultimately truth manifests and falsehood disappears. And then what happens is people go into decline. And if you can read the Quran and look, there's deep analyses of societies in the Quran. So what happens is that the Muslims basically believe that we had such an innate superiority, right, that it really led to a type of superiority complex. That we can't be defeated because we're Muslims. Simple as that. And what happens is that they're defeated. And so there's this massive crisis. How is it that we're defeated? Well, all of a sudden you have all these ignorant Muslims that are seeing these Europeans coming with this massive technology, and they're just knocked out by it, right? I mean, how do you fight people with swords when they have cannons and machine guns and now nuclear missiles, right? And so because of this deep crisis that took place, Islam, in a sense, lost its bearings within the society, but not initially. What happens is very sophisticated. The colonialists come in and they recognize that there's still this thing intact. So we have to really dismantle it. Because as long as there's even a semblance of this thing intact, we're threatened. Our presence here is threatened, and our interests. They're always talking about vested interests. America's vested interests, right? The vital interests of the Gulf region, right? This is what they talk about. They talk about interest, because that's what it's all about, interest. And so what happens is that they recognize the basic and fundamental thing that the Muslims need to be disengaged from is their book. Now, they were already, to a great degree, separated from the book, but not completely. And part of the reason was there were still very strong institutions of learning within the Muslim world. You see, Azhar was still this center of knowledge and learning, and people that went there did learn the whole traditional model, even if it was somewhat solidified. right? It had become solidified, but nonetheless there were people that knew a Quranic worldview, and they were able to explain it to people. People came from all over the world, studied there, went back to their countries. Same in Fez, at the Qarawiyyin, the same in the Yusufiyya, in Marrakesh, the same with the Zaytuna, the Nizamiyya in Baghdad, and Turkey, the madrasas that were all over Turkey. So there was this thing that was still somewhat intact. And so what happens is, and it's very sophisticated how they did it, is that they recognized that they had to break this historical link that the Muslims had with these traditions. So what they made the Muslims feel is that they were backward, and that these traditions were backward, that writing on a board and memorizing the Quran is backward, because now we have paper. Right? And so the Muslims developed this deep sense of inferiority. Whereas what destroyed them was their superiority complex, right? Of thinking we can never be destroyed, so let's just sit around and drink sugared drinks in the palaces of Istanbul or the palaces of Cairo or wherever they were. And then the Europeans, meanwhile, are busy whittling away at developing more sophisticated crossbows, more sophisticated cruel and barbaric ways of killing Muslims. And before you know it, they were there, right? With their cruel and barbaric ways of killing Muslims. And the Muslims were kind of like, what happened, right? Like waking up from a dream. And so the whole educational system begins to be dismantled. And this is all documented. You can actually go and read how they did this. Right? They studied it. They sent in people, studied the whole thing, recognized here's key issues. These are the things they're divisive about. They reintroduced areas of divisiveness amongst the Muslims, particularly the Aqidah, which is a big area that the Muslims have always had some Aqidah, like the belief system, but pretty much things were smoothed out, so let's renew this argument, right? So now you have Muslims all over the Muslim world making takfir, right? Calling other Muslims, their aqidah is not straight, and this isn't right, and that's not right, and that goes on all over the Muslim world now, right? So as these institutes are destroyed, the last one that was actually intact was the Yusufiyya, which in 1938 is basically finished off by the French. And so there you've severed now completely the Muslims from a historical link to their traditional understanding of Islam. And what emerges out of this is a new... I'm going to get to... If you don't think this has anything to do with dawah, it does. But I'm going the long way around, right? So just be patient. We've got how much time left? How long have I been talking? 20 minutes. Okay. Is this boring? Okay. All right. I just want to make sure, because I'm, like I said, about 37,000 feet. So. I keep wanting to say coffee, tea. So, where were we? Right, the Yusufiyya. So what happens is they dismantled all these, and what's left is a few kind of places left in the middle of Swat Valley in Pakistan or India or the deserts of Mauritania or Mali. And the only people now that go to religious schools are the people that can't get into any other school, right? So you've got like 4th and 5th, 6th-rate intellects studying Islamic law that was written by first-rate intellects, right? Now that's a big problem, because they can't understand them. So now they've had to rewrite all the old books in this new, what they call fiqh al-wadih, right? Clear fiqh, like clear jurisprudence, because that other stuff was so difficult and ambiguous. What it means is jurisprudence for mentally incapacitated people, right? So we wonder why we're not producing any first-rate thinkers in Islamic thought, right? because nobody's studying it. They're all in engineering school discovering the latest cruel and barbaric way to blow up people. And they're working for Rockwell International doing it, or wherever, I don't know. I mean, isn't that what Muslims are? All the brilliant Muslims are. I just met this guy who's like a PhD in nuclear physicist from Algeria, and he's working on a new laser device to zap people, right? Which is probably nicer than a crossbow through the heart. But nonetheless, it's kind of got the same mentality there, right? Fry your enemy. That'll be the motto of the corporation that sells it, right? You don't have to drop smart bombs, just make them disappear. With our new laser device that can actually be automated from your command control in Washington, D.C. with the satellite over Dubai. So you don't even have to go over there, right? No more costs of shipping all the troops over and all this logistics. Just push a button and Baghdad disappears. I mean, that's where they're heading, isn't it? It seems like that, if you look at it. If you want to get into arms, that's a real interesting, right? These great Western people that love peace, and the United Nations is founded on breaking down weapons, swords into plowshares, right? So we can grow wheat for everybody. And these same people, right, are sitting on the boards of corporations that are spreading vast amounts of highly destructive technology all over the third world. Over 50% of arms sales goes to the third world. And 49% of that goes to the Middle East itself. But those same people are there saying, we will not let anything interfere with the peace process, right? Except our profits, right? Because we can't interfere with that, right? Because that's the bottom line, which is what these people are all about, the bottom line. So there you have it, right? That's the state of the Muslim world now. And now America's worked out even a better way, right, of dealing with the whole thing. America is so sophisticated, right? They're like eons ahead of everybody else in how to control and manipulate people. So the Americans say, let's not dismantle anything. Let's let them do whatever they want, but let's broadcast our television programs there. So you can all just sit and vegetate and watch I Love Lucy reruns in Cairo in Arabic, right? أنا أحب Lucy, right? بحبك يا Lucy. I mean, that's what they're doing in Cairo. It's a big crisis because the Quranic madrasas now, the children can't memorize the Quran because they're memorizing I Love Lucy reruns, right? I mean, seriously. This is actually happening. People can't memorize anymore because they sit and watch flickering cathode rays that zap your brain, right? So before you know it, there's no longer any neurological pathways, so people can't think anymore. And that's why they continue watching it, because it gets more and more thoughtless each year. Because they realize now in Hollywood, why produce really expensive stuff when people are so stupid now? We can just put anything on there. So now they have all these programs where they just run around behind people in 911, right? They don't even have to pay for actors or anything. They just run around, actual real people, quote unquote, and film them. And then people sit and watch these things, right? They watch them. So anyway, what's this have to do with dawah? What it has to do with dawah is that we're up against very serious competition. When we call people to Islam, we're up against I Love Lucy reruns and 911, right? Which is a real concern for people that have to do dawah. But nobody's doing it, so why even worry about it, right? Well, what it has to do with dawah is the fact that there's an Arab proverb that has a lot of truth in it, and it says, فَاقِدُ شَيْءٍ لَا يُعْطِيهِ. Somebody that doesn't have something can't give it, right? Now, Islam is obviously something, and according to the Muslim belief, it's the most precious thing. But if you don't have it, you can't give it. Now, if we look at Islam, right, Islam has basic two fundamental aspects to it. The first, and we could almost look at it like Mecca and Medina, and it's beautiful, the dichotomy between the two, that we've been given Mecca and Medina, and they're very different. Mecca is mountainous, it's rugged, it's harsh. All the people are harsh. Not all of them, but most of them. And Medina is all flat and soft and easy. It's actually, Mecca is called Wa'ar, and Medina is called Sahal. One means hard, and the other means easy, soft. And the people in Medina are all easy and soft, right? In Mecca, it's like this guy was trying to do, I was just there, and this guy wanted to do tawaf, right? And he was trying to get through people, and these people from Mecca didn't want him to get through and told him to go around. And he said, the guy said, just do tawaf from outside, right, from way out there. Don't go up there. And the guy looks at me and says, Anta fag warai, you know, you're like, what a sweet man you are. Great sense of humor. So the point of that little story is that there's this dichotomy, and really the way we look at it is there's a personal salvation, right, which we can look at as the Meccan period, and then there's a social salvation that we can look at as the Medinan period. And Islam addresses both issues. And oddly enough, the personal salvation is more difficult than the social salvation. That's why if you look at Mecca, it's all persecution and struggle. And Medina is all victory. Right? It became easy once they got to Medina. I mean, they had jihad and they had all this struggle. It was all still there, but it was all of a sudden, it was different. All of a sudden they had what's called izzah in the Arabic language, in the Quranic language. Dignity, and, you know, Allah raised them up. And the secret of their being raised up is that they were so low and humble. Right? That's the secret of it. So you can look, Islam has these two aspects. It has the Meccan, which is the personal salvation, which has two aspects to it. That's all. Very simple. The first aspect is what we believe. And it can be summed up in, when the man asked the Prophet for advice, he said, قُلْ آمَنْتُ بِاللَّهِ ثُمَّ اسْتَقِمْ. Say, I believe in Allah, and then be upright. That's it. That's all there is to it. That is what is called personal Islam. And that is what is ingrained in these people during the Meccan period, is believe in Allah and then act accordingly. Right? And what happens is, if you do that, you will find that people suddenly become hostile. Right? They become hostile. Why? Because all of a sudden your actions are actually threatening the status quo. Because if you start acting upright and everybody else is something else, right? The way the jinn put it is so beautiful. Minna salihun wa minna duna dhalik. Right? We have righteous people and then we have all these other people. Right? So if you act upright, you will find that people start getting a little uneasy. You see, if the woman puts on the hijab and actually, instead of displaying her sexuality, actually covers it and conceals it, all of a sudden people get a little, and they never got worried about nuns, right? All these nuns, right, wearing this, I mean, it's a hijab, right? The nuns wear a hijab. In fact, they probably got it from the Muslims. But nobody ever got up and said, this is against women's rights, right? Well, of course, they'll say, because the nuns chose that, right? That's what they'll say. Well, didn't the Muslim women choose it? No. You see, they've been brainwashed. They only think they chose that. But in reality, they didn't choose that. You see, it's just a socialization. Well, what about the nuns? Isn't that kind of a socialization? No, that's something different. Why? Well, because that's Christianity. An end of argument, right? Oh, okay. I'm silly of me to even question that. So, there you have it, right? If you act upright, you get people upset, which is so odd, right? Because what they say is they want people to act upright. But what they say and what they do, like Mr. Emerson said, your actions shout louder than your words. And the truth of the matter is, we're living in probably the most barbaric society that's ever existed, right? Western civilization. I mean, really what's happened, okay, is that, well, let's look at Queen Elizabeth, right, that great bastion of Christianity. Queen Elizabeth had these characters around her that were called corsairs, right? What the Arabs called qarasina. And really what the corsairs were, they were pirates. And what they did, they went around attacking ships and stealing all their gold and bringing it back and giving a good portion of it to the crown. And so it was kind of like a mafia setup. The queen was like the godmother, or whatever you want to call her. And these guys were all these real slimy henchmen. But it all looked really good, because she was the defender of the faith, right? Christianity, and they were these knights, which were noble titles. But nonetheless, what they went around doing was pirating people. And this develops, right, into colonization. It started out just as these characters running around pirating the Spanish and saying, well, we really do it because we're at war. But what they were really doing is just pirating. So they go back to England, and the English army would actually protect these pirates. And ultimately, the Muslims were kind of this problem, because the Muslims were actually, and it's interesting because this is what the criminal always will say, that the society's unjust. That's the nature of the criminal. He has to say that. In the same way that racism is justified, because really what it's about exploitation. The same thing, criminals will say, it's the society that did this to me, right? That's what they'll do. So what these pirates did is they called the Muslim army, right, which was the Ottoman army, pirates. And they were actually these noble people, because the Ottoman navy actually patrolled the Mediterranean, and they had tributes, just like now you have tributes, right? Like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and all these, they just paid a big giant one for this army to go out there and defend their little kingdoms, whatever you want to call them, sheikdoms or something. But it's the same basic principle. So what happens is that this army said, you know, hey, you can't pirate around here because we don't believe in this stuff, right? So suddenly they said, we got to find another way to get around to Asia, because these Muslims are a real pain, right? So they start sending out these, and finally the rest is history, right? They discover this whole thing. So what's happened now is it's become so sophisticated, because these pirates now wear three-piece suits. They don't have patches on their eyes anymore, but they still have skull and bones, right? George Bush, right? Remember the club? He was he's still a member in good standing, right? You have to dig up somebody's bones as your initiation rite, right? Somebody said his was Geronimo, that's what he had to do, go dig up Geronimo's bones. So he's a member of the Skull and Bones Club, which is a very elite, secret club. So is Buckley, right? Everybody know that idiot that poses as an intellectual? He has a television program. Oh, you know, he's got this kind of, what do they call it, firing line or something? So they're all members of the Skull and Bones Club, right? Because that's their old flag. It's the same group. So what they've done is they've solidified all their power, right? And now they work at the level of nations, and actually they've gone beyond that, right? Now they call it the United Nations, which is really just a pirate organization, because they realize that crime doesn't pay, but organized crime does, right? So if we get organized, it'll all work out. And that's what they did. And so here you have it now. The Muslims are in this big spider's web, right? It's been kind of put out all across the world. It's interesting. All their signs and symbols are spider webs. Have you ever noticed that? The United Nations is a spider's web over the earth. and the CBS, it's a spider's web on an eye, right? It's all spider's webs. I mean, I just started to realize, I read a book on spiders. It's not funny. I read it because I wanted, Allah says that they're like spiders, right? And that's what Allah says. كَمِثْلِ عَنْكَبُوتٍ اتَّخَذَتْ بَيْتًا. They're like a spider that takes a house. That's what Allah says about these people. So I wanted to understand that metaphor. So I started reading about spiders. And it's amazing that they're just like spiders. It's a beautiful metaphor. Because spiders, one of the things spiders do is that they actually don't eat their victims. They have this poison they inject in their fangs, a poison that liquefies the interns of their victims, and then they suck all their vital fluids out of them. So all there's left is a shell in this spider's web, right? Which is what we call Western civilization. And now the Muslim world. They're just all shells in this spider's web, right? And the spider keeps getting bigger and bigger. And every time a victim comes into the web, they have the most sophisticated telecommunication system, the spiders, right? They don't need satellites. But it's very similar. They always have a string attached to the web, so anything that touches the web, even if they're sleeping, like spiders sleep, even if they're sleeping, the web shakes and they wake up and they run to the web. And if it's a big victim, and they realize they might get out of the web, they have all these milking glands, and they squirt all this extra silk onto their victims, so they totally cover them up in this stuff. But if it's just a little one, right, then they just kick back in the White House and just watch it kind of die, right? So, I mean, seriously, like Iraq was kind of a big victim, right? So they went down there and they like shot out all this stuff and got them completely wrapped up, whereas Bosnia is kind of this, I mean, it's not funny, it's not a joke, but it's a metaphor. Bosnia is this kind of little victim stuck in the web, that they can just sit back and watch it suffocate, right? From the webs of intrigue that they've created. I mean, it's interesting that this Jewish writer wrote what he called about how they armed Iraq. It's called the Spider's Web, right? It's an interesting book to read, the Spider's Web. So that's what they do. So what's this have to do with dawah? I know you're all asking that question. It has a lot to do with dawah. Because what we're dealing with now in the Muslim society is a society in turmoil. And in really decay decay kind of indicates that there's still something alive there. Right? I mean, if something's in a decaying state, it's not completely wiped out. But it's almost too easy a word to use. The way I look at the Muslim world, it's like, I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book called Coma, where they kept these people alive just in a coma so that they could use their organs. Right? And that's what the Western powers do to the Muslim world. They keep them just in a comatose state so they can get their oil and get their cotton and get all this, right, as organ donors. Because they have a dying society up here in the West that's based on consumption. And that's the only thing. See, the meaning of these people's lives is to consume. And if you take that away from them, all of a sudden they're in a complete void. And voids are scary. 80% of Americans that attempt meditation have acute anxiety attacks. Because they close their eyes and all of a sudden they say, oh my God, I'm inside myself. Give me something to look at, some stimulation. Turn on the television. Turn on the music, right? Let me look at a billboard. They get very uneasy, right? Because all of a sudden they might have to think about something. Like, why am I here? Why was I created? Where am I going when I die? Right? Those are kind of scary questions for somebody that's never given them an ounce of thought. right? And they've kind of lived their lives based on the fact that those questions don't exist. I mean, it's very frightening. You see them on their deathbeds, right? I used to work in a critical care unit and watch them die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I saw that many times. Why? Because that's the way they've lived their lives, you see. They're frightened. They're scared. You know, and what Islam is about taking away fear. See, if you're a Muslim, well, what are you afraid of? Right? Because the first thing that you accept as a Muslim, the very first thing, there's no God but Allah. Which means there's nothing that I should have any fear of except God. And therefore everything else becomes secondary. Death is a secondary. See, if you believe in God, if you believe in the fact that you were created for a purpose and that you're going somewhere and it all has meaning, then all of a sudden everything becomes secondary to that primary fact, which it is a fact. You see, I mean, the Prophet said, إِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ حَقٌّ وَالنَّارَ حَقٌّ وَالْقِيَامَ حَقٌّ. It's all haqq, it's all true. The fire is true. The Jannah, the garden is true. The day of rising and judgment is true. The mizan, the balance is true. Going into these things. So really, getting back to this, what we're calling people to, first of all, we have to call ourselves. That's the first thing, right? We have to call ourselves every day. I mean, you have to be giving dawah to yourself constantly, every day of your life. It doesn't stop. You become Muslim, that's... People, I've seen people that become Muslim and I tell them, some people kind of get upset when I explain Islam to them. People that have become Muslim that I've given shahada to. And people around it say, why'd you tell them all that stuff? It was so heavy, right? Because it's better they stay out of the house, right, than come in and be a foul guest, right? I mean, if you don't want to observe the manners of the house, don't come into the house. Because the house has manners, and the house has a Lord. He's called Rabbul Bayt. And if you come into Darul Islam, into the abode of Islam, you better observe the manners of the house. And the manners of the house came from the Lord of the house. And if you don't want to observe them, get out of the house. Because you're just fouling up the house. And that's what's happened all over the Muslim world. You have these people that are claiming they're in the house, right? But they don't use the toilet. They urinate wherever they want to, right? They leave the food all over the place just to rot. So give the house a stench. And then people that see the house think, you know, it's like somebody that looks at a mansion that's totally dilapidated, right? And they think, I wouldn't want to live there, right? As a beautiful, it looks like it was a beautiful thing at one time. I mean, that's the way people look at Islam now. If you hear Orientals talk about Islam, the golden years of Islam, right? That's what they talk about, the golden years of Islam. Because now they look at it, it's just like a mansion in total dilapidation, right? So what we want to do is find out where the carpenters are to rebuild this thing, right? Because it's there. All the blueprint, I mean, what we have now, that house is gone, right? What they call the golden years, it's over. تِلْكَ الْأُمَمْ قَدْ خَلَتْ لَهَا مَا كَسَبَتْ وَلَكُمْ مَا كَسَبْتُمْ. Those people, they're gone. They have what they earn, and you have what you earn. You see, they're gone. We can't live off them anymore. It's no longer viable. But what we have is we have a vision of what it was once, at one time, but we also have an intact blueprint. And what we need is a critical mass of people that will take on this deen personally, take on it as individuals, and then call other people to it. You see, we have to rectify our homes. We have to rectify our character. We have to become people of istiqamah, of uprightness. And if we're not, we can't call anybody to anything, because we don't have anything to call people to. It's an empty call, you see. And dawah is not an empty call. I mean, da'wah is a call to the house, to the abode of Islam. It's calling people enter into the abode. And right now, my sustenance, and I'm sure many of your sustenance, is a personal sustenance. Because we're not living social Islam. You see, I would love to be living social Islam. I would love to be living in a society where there weren't thieves, because people don't need to steal. Where there weren't drugs, because people don't have need to get out of their state and into a state that puts them into a sense of oblivion, where they don't have to think about the problems of their lives. You see, where women aren't beaten in their homes because they have recourse to ways of solving their marital disputes and their troubles that are humane and that are based on justice and wisdom. You see, I mean, that's the society that I yearn for, is a society where people can live Islam, where knowledge is the highest and most primary function of the human being, to acquire knowledge and to worship based on that knowledge acquired. Al-Bukhari has a chapter in his great opus that's called Bab al-Ilm qabla al-Qawli wal-Amal, the chapter of knowledge before speaking and action. You see, because Islam is based on knowledge. The first thing that comes down in the Quran is Iqra, Bismi Rabbika alladhi khalaq. Read. That's the first thing that comes down. Read what? In the name of your Lord. Learn knowledge in the name of your Lord. Learn knowledge because Allah has... Don't learn knowledge to make more money, right? Don't learn knowledge to get a degree. Don't learn knowledge so that you can go work for a corporation that's developing new and improved ways of killing people. Learn knowledge because you were commanded to learn knowledge. And then apply that knowledge. And then take that knowledge out to other people. And that's what Islam is about. It's a very fundamental call back to the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam, to the way of the Hanif. And Ibrahim was a simple man living in the midst of a desert in a tent. But he had the deepest spiritual experience of anyone in his time. You see, because he was a Hanif. He was a man who... Hanif is an upright man. It's a man that believes in the deen of fitrah, the inherent religion of man and woman, which is Islam, and acts upright. And that is Ibrahim. And our call is to the way of Ibrahim, as it was finalized in the way of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's the call of the Muslims. And it's the call of truth. And the people that hear it and respond to it will be the people whose hearts have that mule, have that Hanafiya, you see. And they're out there. They have to be. I don't believe that they're not. And we have to go find them. That's your job in Toronto. Right? They're out there. They must be. I don't believe they're not. Because this is the fitrah. It's the inherent nature. People will never be happy until they submit to Allah. And people won't be happy until they know why they were created. And the Quran tells us to worship Him, to adore Him, to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, that's what it's about. So we have that individual Islam, and that's all we have now. Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, has been reduced to your own body. You are Dar al-Islam now. There is no longer this integral thing that we can call Dar al-Islam and this other thing that we can call Dar al-Harb. This is a time when, as the Arabs say, اختلط الحابر بالنابل. Everything's mixed up. Nothing's clear anymore. I mean, that's the truth of the matter. And the only thing that is clear, right, is the vision of this teaching. Because it's still there and it's still intact and it's there for the one that takes it up. But it has certain conditions. And just to say a few things about the conditions. The first condition is sincerity. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدَ اللَّهِ مُخْلِصِينَ. They were only commanded to worship Allah with sincerity, with ikhlas. Lahuddin. The deen is for Allah. It's not for you. It's not a personal way of being better than other people. It's not a way of banging people over the heads with hadith or ayahs of verses of Quran. You see, which some people do. They take, the deen becomes this tool whereby I can become a petty tyrant. In the same way that Saddam Hussein is a big tyrant. right? So I can beat people over the head with hadith. The teaching is a teaching of tabshir. It's not a teaching of tanfir. It's a teaching of calling people in the best way, of calling people back to their own selves, you see, of the real true nature, which is submission. That is the true nature of man, is to be in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is what the call is. It's a call to that bushra, that good news. That if you submit to Allah, if from a believer or a male or a female, وَمَنْ عَمِلَ صَالِحًا وَهُوَ مِنْ ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ. For whoever does a righteous action after their belief, right, from male or female, and they have iman, then Allah tells us, لَنُحْيَنَّهُمْ حَيَاةً طَيِّبًا. We will bring to life for them a beautiful and pure life. You see, so even in the midst of all this turmoil, those people who have that individual sense of Islam will have a hayat tayyibah, a pure and beautiful life. And that will be able to sustain them through this time, because we're in times of sabr. We're in the time that the Prophet ﷺ said, holding on to Islam is like holding on to a coal of fire. That's what it's like, you see. And Islam is about sabr, inna Allah ma'a sabirin, and da'wah is about learning sabr, about learning patience, about learning how to interact with people, about learning how to subjugate the nafs, about learning how to become humble. And it's difficult, and it's a journey, and we're all on it, you see. None of us have arrived. We arrive when we die. And the whole thing is a process of becoming better and better, you see. I wish Islam was a coat that you could buy in a store and just put it on, and all of a sudden you're a Muslim. But it's not. It's not acquired with ease. It's painfully acquired. And so I'm just been given the warning from the moderator. That's nice. Usually it says 10 minutes. Usually they say 22 seconds left, right? I won't mention any places where I've had that happen to me. So I'm going to just cut it here, because my thoughts have been a little disconnected, right? Like I said, it's an age of disintegration. So my talk was a little disintegrated, but it just has to do, I'm using excuses, right? The Arabs, they say, الْعُذْرُ أَقْبَحْ مِنَ الذَّنْبِ. Like, this excuse is worse than what you did wrong. So I'm just going to stop it here, and if people have questions, I'm going to remain standing, because I'll probably fall asleep if I sit down. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. Oh, okay, we're gonna take a break. Alhamdulillah.
We're going to have a 15-minute break. There's refreshments outside. There should be some downstairs and upstairs as well, I hope. Take time to look at the different displays we have, and we have some books and videotapes as well. Some of Hamza Yusuf's videotapes are also available in the back there. And inshallah, 15 minutes we'll call you back.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين. Call to Islam and ridicule Christianity and Christians while addressing an audience in the bastion of Christian learning in Canada, University of Toronto. Da'wah is not a forum to ridicule anyone. Ameenullah. Well, my background, I was actually raised a Greek Orthodox, and Greek Orthodox are cruel and mean people. Right? They're the ones that are bombing Sarajevo. So I've still got some of that cruel and mean streak in me. I went to Catholic Jesuit schools as well. So part of my distaste for modern Christianity is my experience with it. but I'm certainly not speaking as somebody that was born Muslim, right? And then like Ahmadidat, right? Everybody's favorite critique of Christianity. But I accept that as a criticism. Because it's a question, but it's really a criticism, and I accept that. And it's not good to ridicule people or other religions. And but on one hand, I'm going to get nasty now. The Quran says, "عاقبوا بمثل ما عوقبتم به," like fight them the way they fight you, right? And I've read so many books written by fundamental Christians. I've actually got about 15 of them in my library, and I've read quite a few of them. One, because you can read them in about 10 minutes, and two, because it's important to know your enemy. And I do say enemy because these people are really very adamantly against Islam. One of them is Sharush's book. I don't know if any of you know that man, but he's a Palestinian Christian who purposely ridicules Islam, purposely makes fun of the Quran, and says terrible things. Another one is called The Islamic Invasion, which was written by so-called PhD in Islamic Studies. I don't know what PhD stands for in that case. And one of the things in there, just to give you an example of what this guy says, unlike Christianity, the Muslims believe in a cruel God, right? Nowhere in the Quran is the love of God displayed, right? And another one of the things he says, Allah is really the name of a moon goddess, right? And that's why the Muslims worship the Kaaba, which has a rock there that they believe came from the moon, right? That was once white, right, the color of the moon, now it's black. So I've read a lot of those books. They make me very angry, and sometimes that anger manifests a little bit. But I do accept the general criticism. I will say the Quran does honor the people of the book, Ahlul Kitab, particularly the Christians, but even the Jews, in the sense that they're people of a book, a true book. What exists now, the Torah, right, and the Injil, that the Quran talks about, no longer exist. What exists now are books that have been grossly altered, right? So and so when I was talking about what if you read the Bible, and I have read the Bible, a lot of people have not read the Bible. In fact, somebody called me the other day and said that he had written an article for the newspaper in California, and one of the things that he'd said was, that Muslims do not force other people to become Muslims. There's no coercion. La ikraha fi d-din, right? There's no coercion in the deen. And so this person wrote back a rebuttal to this same newspaper and said, you can say that, but the truth of the matter is your book says kill them wherever you find them, right? And there is a verse in the Quran that actually does say that, right? قَاتِلُوهُمْ حَيْثُ وَجَدْتُمُوهُمْ. But the Quran, if you look, the Quran says وَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ, right? Woe to those who pray. Beware of those who pray, right? Woe to those who pray. So if I quote that to you, now you would automatically think, if you'd never heard the Quran, so the Quran obviously is against praying, right? Well, you have to finish the ayah, right? الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ, right? Those that are heedless in their prayers. In other words, the hypocrites. So the Quran has to be taken in context. If you take it out of context, then you lose the meaning. And so that's what this person did. He took a verse out of contextual context, or thematic context, and then it looks one thing. So I wrote back for him a letter, and I quoted Psalm 138, right, which says, smash the babies of Iraq's heads up against the... Blessed are those who smash the babies of Iraq's heads up against the... Or the babies' heads of Iraq up against the rocks of Zion, right? So I said, obviously the Bible is calling us to smash Iraqi babies' heads up against rocks, which looks like scriptural justification for Desert Storm. So, and then the other one, which is, if you really want to read the interesting section of the Bible, is Deuteronomy. So after accepting the criticism, here I am ridiculing this book, so I apologize for that. Anyway, Christians, there are genuinely devout Christians, good people. I believe that. In fact, one of the difficulties I had after becoming Muslim was the fact that I have met Christians that I really believe were totally genuine in their love for God. And I just had the difficulty with understanding that and things like Inna Deen 'Inda Allah Islam. And actually Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah solved that difficulty for me in his book called Al-Jawab al-Kafi, which is the complete answer. And in that book he says that there are different types of love. And he said that there's love of God. And he said, but this love is not enough. And it's the love that Christians and Jews and idol worshippers have for God. And so what he was indicating there was that Christians, Jews, and idol worshippers can actually love God. Which to me, it made sense for me in understanding how I have met people from different faiths who have a genuine love of God. But what he says is that what is needed is love of what Allah loves. Not simply love of Allah, but love of what Allah loves. And hate of what Allah hates. And that is called Sharia. Right? That is the code whereby the human being acts according to the way that Allah has commanded the person to act. And so I would say that I do apologize if I offended anybody in here that is Christian. We're in I really think particularly in the West, in a post-Christian era. I think the religion has, it's very difficult for Christians to actually be a moral authority or a moral voice because of what's happened to their religion, and certainly what's happened to the leaders of their religion. And those televangelists that I ridiculed, I think any devout, true Christian would ridicule them as well, because they're an object of ridicule. They're the worst type of people, and because they exploit people's spiritual needs, and I'm certainly opposed to that. So I apologize, and I accept that criticism. Any other question?
Can I just ask anyone who has a question from the floor? We have 2 microphones, so please feel free to come to that microphone and sisters and that microphone to the brothers. We have a few more written questions here. I'll take a question from the floor first. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Question is related to the issue of doubt. A lot of the Muslim youth who come from Arab countries or African countries, they get to marry non-Muslim girls. And those girls, they get to convince them that they are Muslims so that they get married, because these Muslim youths are good, they make good husbands, they will behave. And then after a little while, my Muslim brother naively thinks that he is marrying a good wife, and then after a few weeks she's back with her family to church. And the poor man is so much devastated, frustrated, almost to the point that he might get crazy or something. So we understand that it is allowable in Islam to get married to non-Muslims. But if you would get to that point, don't we think that it's not good to do? We better off get married to a good Muslim girl and maintain a strong Islamic family, a Muslim family, instead of that. What's your opinion about it?
Inshallah, a'udhu billahi min al-ara. Seek refuge in Allah from opinions. I think it's a big social crisis that a lot of Muslims do come to these countries, and certainly youth come, and there's what Zbigniew Brzezinski calls. I always wonder about, there's a lot of Americans that say, oh, I go ridicule. I can ridicule them because I'm an American. A lot of Americans say, so what's your name? Abdul Aziz. Abdul what? Right? But they can get Zbigniew Brzezinski and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Well, if you give them a name like Abdul Aziz, they say, Abdul what? Look, I'll just call you Abdul. And you're kind of like, well, actually that means slave, right? So I'm not a slave. I'm the slave of Al-Aziz, right? Which they don't say. They end up saying, okay. And so that you get Abdul, right, working at whatever they're working at. Or they change it to Mike or something like that. Make it easier. Just call, and I won't say that. Now I got to watch it now because I feel a little self-conscious. Just let me try to finish that question. One of the big troubles is that the foundation of marriage in Islam is an acceptance, right, of Allah and His Messenger. I mean, that is what is going to maintain a marriage. If you don't have recourse to some absolute source, right, or fundamental values, we'll chalk that word, erase that word, fundamental. Take it back. I didn't say that. If you don't have recourse to values, right, or some absolutes, then there'll be troubles. And Islam really should be that source. So if you marry a Christian or a Jewish woman from the people of the book, which according to the Quran is permissible, although there are some strong opinions that it's not permissible to marry Christians. That was Abdullah ibn Umar's opinion, radiallahu anhu, who's a great faqih from Medina, and the son of Umar ibn al-Khattab. And in fact, Shaykh Abdullah al-Ghimari, great Moroccan scholar of this age, actually wrote a book against it, saying, and his proofs, I think he does it from, there's an usuli principle called Sadd al-Dhara'i', which is like cutting off the pretext. And what he considered was, if you were in a Muslim society and the woman was Christian, that should you die, for instance, then the society would take it upon themselves to make sure that your children were raised as Muslims. Whereas if you're in a Christian society, you see, and you marry a Christian woman and you happen to die, which is certainly a possibility, then she could raise your children Christian, right? And you don't have any way of preventing that. And so that was his opinion about that. I personally think some of the finest Muslims that I have met have been women that have converted to Islam. There's some very strong Muslim sisters that have converted from Christianity and Judaism and other religions to Islam. And I would certainly make that a condition before I married, for that reason, for the children. So that's where I stand about that. I'm a 19-year-old student who is very confused with whether I should get a university education or fight for jihad. Okay. Can you elaborate on the disparity of secular education and religious education, how they can be merged? Yeah. Well, that's a very long answer, because you have to go into really about jihad and what jihad is and what the prerequisites for that. One of the basic principles of jihad, though, especially at your age, would be taking permission from your family. And the other thing about, a lot of where there are Muslim crises, the problem is not actual numbers of people, but it's actually basically get down to it, military hardware and logistical needs. I mean, the Bosnians have vastly outnumber the Serbs, but they're completely unarmed, you see. So the crisis there is not a number of people. And the same was true in Afghanistan. You know, I was in Peshawar when the Russians were still there, and that was one of the things that they told me. There's plenty of people. It's about weapons, hardware. And Kashmir is the similar situation, and the Philippines, Eritrea. I mean, what we have is really not a shortage of manpower, but we have a shortage. One, we don't have true leadership. In other words, there's no governments that are supporting the besieged Muslims wherever they are. And two, there's just not weapons, right? So, yeah, you have to just think about that. Can you elaborate on the disparity of secular education and religious education, how they can be merged? Well, I was saying to somebody earlier that there's in Islamic, in an Islamic society, there would be no such thing as secular education. It doesn't exist. Because there's no such thing as secular knowledge. There's only fard ayn and fard kifaya. Any knowledge is either classified as a ayn, a kifaya, makruh, or muharram. Right? And that's all there is. So, for instance, fard ayn would be you have to learn how to pray. Everybody has to know how to pray. If you go to Umrah, you have to know how to do Umrah. I'll give you an example. At the Kaaba, there's all these people that go around Kaaba, and they're in ihram, and they're going, and they'll go along touching the Kaaba as they make the tawaf, which breaks your shalt, right? Your circumambulation around the Kaaba. It actually breaks it, right, if you touch the Kaaba. Because you're inside the Kaaba, because there's this marble layer that goes out. It's called Shadarwan, and it's actually part of the Kaaba, right? The original foundations of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And tawaf is around the Kaaba. So if you go in, you're actually, part of your body is inside the Kaaba. So it invalidates your shalt. Right? Now some people can say, well, you're picking hairs there, but you're not, because that's the nature of Sharia. You have things that you do and things that you don't do. That's all Sharia is, awamir and nawahi. It's commands and prohibitions. And so you have to, if you go on Umrah, it becomes fard ayn upon you to learn how to do Umrah. You can't go there with a book, and as you get there to the black stone, you start looking, now, how do I do this? It shouldn't be to that point. And you see people like that during Hajj. They're trying to work out how to do their Hajj when they should have learned it back home. So that's a fard ayn, right? If you buy and sell, you have to learn the rules of buying and selling. You cannot do anything without knowing how to do it. And it's an important element of our teaching, is to learn what Allah has commanded you to do. Umar radiallahu anhu used to go into the suq, into the marketplace, and he would actually test people. Right? It's called, nowadays they call it quality assurance. Right? But I mean, the Muslims have that concept in our deen, in the Sharia. Yeah, he used to go in and he used to pull the dates off the top to see if the ones underneath were as good as the ones on top. And if they weren't, he would tell them that you're ghash, you know, that you're cheating people. Right? It's like you go to the Safeway. Do you have Safeway in Canada? No? Okay. I saw in Saudi Arabia, safest way, right? And it had the big S. It was just like Safeway, right? But it's called safest way. Some poor Saudi guy went to school in California and went back and said, I want to make something just like America. So, safest way. 'Cause there was probably some legalistic problems with calling it Safeway. So, but there they'll always have the big strawberries on the top. Big giant ones, and then if you actually, when you buy it and then pull off the top, all the ones at the bottom are squashed and small. That's the same principle, right? It's ghash. وَمَنْ غَشَّانَ فَلَيْسَ مِنَّا. وَمَنْ غَشَّانَ فَلَيْسَ مِنَّا. The one that cheats us isn't from us. So that's what Umar used to do, right? So you have to learn those things. Now, the other knowledges are called fard kifaya, furud al-kifaya, like medicine is a religious knowledge because it's an obligation on some people to learn it. So it's not secular. It is by its nature religious because Muslims don't have a concept of secular. See, the Christians Right? I'll try to watch myself here. The Christians split the religion at a point when they say that Jesus said, and I don't believe it, but they say that Jesus said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and give unto God what is God. Now, I don't believe a prophet would say that, because we don't believe anything is for Caesar. We say, al-mulku lillah. Everything is Allah's. So how can you give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's? Everything is God's. Right? So, but that verse in the New Testament is the verse that's used to split church and state. Right? Now, we don't have that problem because, one, we don't have a church. There's no church. And two, we don't really have a state. Right? So it's a Christian problem, church and state. Muslims have what's called a dawla, which is actually a later, it's a later invention of the fuqaha to call dawla in the ahkam al-siyar, like diplomatic rules. The dawla is the opposite of state. State comes from a Latin word which means status, right? Which is staying the same. We get static from it, like static, the status quo, the way things are. Dawla actually means the thing that's constantly changing. So it's really the opposite of a state. One, because what states do is they hoard wealth, right? What the Islamic government does is it gives wealth out. There's no hoarding. In fact, zakat has to be redistributed immediately. It has to go back into the community. And by Islamic law, it's supposed to be gathered in the community and redistributed back into the very same community. There's no centralization of power in Islamic law. There's no Washington, D.C. Right? That is a totally... What there is a khalifa, which is it's a representation of the prophetic hub, whereby everything revolves around it, you see. That's what it is. He is the Khalifa of who? Of the Messenger of Allah. That's what the Khalifa is. If he obeys him, we obey him. If he disobeys him, we don't disobey, you see. So our hearing and obeying is based on his hearing and obeying, right? And so if he's not hearing and he's not obeying, then we don't listen to him and we don't obey him. And that's from Umar radiallahu anhu when he took out, he gave a khutbah, a talk to some people, and he said, radiallahu anhu, what would you do if Umar started going crooked? And one of the Sahaba pulled his sword out and said, I'd straighten you with this. And so Umar said, Alhamdulillah, there's still people in this ummah that would straighten Umar if he went crooked. So he was just checking. That's what they call a checks and balance system, right? In Washington, you have Congress and the President. That's a checks and balance. You have to have that system. So Umar was giving us the concept of checks and balances, you see, to remind us future generations. If he starts going astray, we have to straighten him out, right? Now, what happens when everybody goes crooked? That's the problem. So, I have a reputation of giving very long answers. All right, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Right on the left there. Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
I first would like to thank you, brother, for your good coverage of the historical factors that were somehow led to the decline of the Muslim Ummah. It's not the only factor, however.
Right, well, it's very complicated. Yeah.
Now, my point was that when you talked about da'wah and you divided it up in Mecca and Medina, and you probably made some comparison between what happened then and what could probably be our situation now. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. Whatever the Prophet ﷺ had given you, you take. Whatever he's forbidden,
yeah, you abstain.
That includes everything, and it includes the method, the tariqah with which we call for Islam and Dawah. It just felt or seemed that you've isolated that what Dawah is now is just to look at yourself and build yourself, your Muslim personality, and look at other personality like it's individualistic. It's more, it doesn't, it's linked, it has no links to the societal level, because if the sum of individuals doesn't make a society, and if we have 100% Muslim individuals, it doesn't necessarily make by that in itself a Muslim society or a Muslim dawla or a government.
Right.
So there must be, as we see in the seerah of the Prophet
ﷺ,
from earlier times in Mecca, he sent his messengers to leaders of the greatest nations then, like Kisra and Herakl, and he asked them to get into Islam, and he also went around the tribes around Mecca asking them to get and to give him rule, to rule by Allah's rules and Allah's Sharia. Some of them gave him conditional rule, he rejected. So he was after something. The idea is that there is a method he outlined for us, and we can see clearly in the seerah. And alhamdulillah, we have many Muslims here, Muslim brothers, who I think are a bit knowledgeable about the seerah and who can see things, who can read and see it more. Maybe if you can outline it much stronger, because it felt like it's only individualistic.
No, when I talk, I try to talk to the audience I'm speaking to. People have, there's called maratat al-taklif, right?
Yes.
And people have different taklif, which is your responsibility. There's different responsibilities. For the vast majority of people, they are not responsible for instance, the rulers, the people that are to rectify the rulers are the ulama. Right? These are the people that have to rectify the rulers. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said that the greatest jihad, أعظم جهاد كلمة الحق أمام سلطان جائر. The biggest jihad is actually dawah. It's a word. It's not fighting or anything. The biggest jihad is speaking the truth in front of an unjust ruler. The people that speak the truth are the people that have what are called hujjaj and barahin. They're the people of proofs and of sound arguments. And those are the ulama, you see. And that's why all of the early communities said that the fasad al-dunya, right, the destruction of the world is with the destruction of the ulama and the umara. Because the ulama and the umara have to have this relationship. One has to be rectifying the other, you see. And if they don't, then you get disintegration, which is what's happened in our societies now. Most of the ulama have aligned themselves with unjust rulers. And so they have lost their status within the Muslim societies. People really don't listen to them because they see them sitting next to Pharaoh. And if you're sitting next to Pharaoh, you're in bad company, right? So my point is that I've been Muslim now almost 18 years, and I've heard a lot since the time I became Muslim until now. And what I've recognized is that there's a lot of talk, and talk is very cheap. And you can sit around in cafes and discuss about the way things should be, but if people aren't changing some very fundamental things, which is not to ignore other aspects, you see, but the rectification of societies takes place from those people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them the intellectual gifts and the spiritual gifts for that transformation. The vast majority of people don't have those, the tools, right, adawat, the tools of that change, which is to actually change not just themselves, but to change the society. People, what are called the awam, which I consider myself from them, are the simple people, right, that don't have the deep knowledge that's necessary to present blueprints and present. We have Muslims working very hard, not just in the Muslim world, but outside the Muslim world, for change at the highest levels, do you see? And they have that taklif, and they exist. And there's movements that have been going on for a long time to bring about those change. Do you see what I mean? Did you follow that? Yeah. So our, Muslims should support those that are working towards that change. I personally, the Islam that I studied was, I studied with very classical scholars, mostly from Mauritania, and my understanding of Islam is that Islam is not a revolutionary type of teaching, because khuruj an as-sulta, what's called khuruj an as-sulta in the rules of fiqh, like going out and actually opposing the government and things like that violently, there have to be very specific conditions present for that to take place. And those are fiqh details that we could go into here. So Islam is a total picture, and I'm not trying to say that it's one isolated aspect. What I'm saying is that is the beginning point for us as individuals. And if we have not begun there, then there's no point in trying to get somewhere else. You see, you have to start, everything starts with steps. A child first learns to crawl, and then it learns to walk, and then it learns to run. And that's the nature of growth. It's progressive. There's this Arabic saying that says, طَعَامُ الْكِبَارِ ثُمَّ الصِّغَارِ. The food of the giants is poison for the little ones, right? The food of adults is poisonous for babies. You can't feed babies meat, you see.
But just one comment here.
Yeah, تفضل.
Just that when Mus'ab bin Umair
radiallahu anhu
was sent to Yathrib, then it was then called Medina later.
Yeah.
He prepared the society, he prepared the base, not necessarily of ulama.
Yeah, where's Mus'ab? That's what we want, Mus'ab. Yeah, that's what we want, Mus'ab ibn Umair.
There is goodness
Alhamdulillah.
in me and in this ummah instead of the day of the
There's, alhamdulillah.
We shouldn't lose hope, from Allah.
I wouldn't be here if I lost hope. I'd be at home with my family, sleeping.
Preparing the society, that's what brought Mus'ab.
Radiallahu anhu. Yeah, but who prepared Mus'ab? Mus'ab didn't come out of a vacuum. Yeah, Mus'ab had very serious training. Like the ulama, you see, they talk about degrees of da'wah. The first degree is called tabligh, right? Which is actually where individuals who have taken it actually go out and spread the message. The second degree is called taqween, right? Which is where the people that accept the message then are molded into actual real characteristics of that message. And then the final stage is tamkeen, which is when Allah يُمَكِّنُهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ, and that's a promise in the Quran. But there's what's called in the Quran a jumla haliyah in the Arabic language, which is a sentence of state. In other words, if the condition exists, then that thing exists. And in the ayat of tamkeen that Allah says, وَلَا يُمَكِّنَنَّكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ, right? He will establish you in the earth. يَعْبُدُونَ اللَّهَ لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِهِ شَيْئًا. They worship Allah and they do not associate anything with Him. That is the jumla haliyah that Allah promises. If that exists, the other thing exists. If you look at the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا. Oh, you who believe, have taqwa, have conscious awareness of Allah, right? And say truthful things. Be upright in your speech. In other words, have the awareness of Allah. And taqwa is behavioral. It's not i'tiqad. Taqwa is not the way you think. It's the way you act. In other words, behave like a Muslim and speak like a Muslim. Now look at what's called the result of that, right? يُصْلِحْ لَكُمْ أَعْمَالَكُمْ. He rectifies your state. يُصْلِحْ لَكُمْ أَعْمَالَكُمْ وَيَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُمْ. And He will forgive all of your wrong actions. So, in other words, your worldly affairs are rectified and your other worldly affairs are rectified. And then Allah tells us, إِنَّ عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ عَلَى السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَالْجِبَالِ, that He has given this amana. And the amana here, the trust that Allah put forward to the heavens, the earth, and the mountains, and that they refused it, and man took it on, is the takalif al-shar'iyah. It is the responsibility of implementing this teaching in our lives and in ourselves. And if we do that, if people get up at night and call on Allah and do these things, that is primary. That's all I'm saying. If you're not doing that, don't expect anything else to happen, which is not negating the other things. Allah says in the Quran, وَعِدُّ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ وَمِن رِبَاطِ الْخَيْلِ. I mean, all these things exist. Prepare with power and strength and horses, and which could be read what, the means, the necessary means. But see, somebody told me once that, you see, if we were had military strength in Bosnia, this would have never happened. That is a fallacious argument, right? In logic, that is a fallacious argument. Because if Allah wants, Allah could have got the Serbs and the Croats killing each other. And then after they all killed everybody, there'd just be Muslims there. They have their country and everything. I mean, it's not based on material. You can't interpret things materialistically. You see, our deen is based on the second principle in the deen is the iman bil ghaib. الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ They believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in the ghaib. They believe in the unseen. So there's other elements acting and happening in creation that we don't see, that we're not consciously aware of, but that are taking place. So rectification, that's all I'm saying, is rectification begins first with the self. If that's not taking place, then all of the other things that extend from that are of no benefit, you see. And if Allah does not give us success, then we have to go back and look at why. And the Muslims have not had success. We have not had success in terms of tamkeen. There's been success, alhamdulillah, in people returning to the deen and these things. And it's happening in the time that Allah wills it to happen. The other thing that one of the North African scholars, Ahmed Zarruq, said is that one of the great tribulations of our time, and he said this in the 9th century, is that people, he said, يستعجلون الفتح دون شروطه, that they try to hurry the victory or the opening without having the conditions. And each one of the stations, right, of the Tabligh, Takween, and the Tamkeen, they have conditions. For instance, in Afghanistan, Shurut al-Nasr were there, but Shurut al-Tamkeen were not there. You see, the conditions of victory were there, but the conditions for establishment were not there. And they are, you can look at them, our scholars have enunciated them very clearly from the Quran. You see, one of the most beautiful books, and I recommend that you read it, is Al-Jawab al-Kafi by Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, because he talks about what is wrong with the society. And his basic and fundamental analysis is it is the wrong actions of the individuals that compose that society. And until that is rectified, until there are not kabair in our societies, everything's going to remain the same. You see, it stays the same, because this is the sunnah this is the way of the divine way that has no change. You see, Allah says that in the Quran. If you read the Quran with ta'ammud, with reflection and depth, it becomes very clear why societies are destroyed and how they're rectified. You see, and we should never forget that Islam is not an ideology. Islam is not an ideology. It's not a political ideology like communism or capitalism or something like that. Islam is a deep, transformative, spiritual power that transforms the individual and transforms the society. It has political aspects, it has social aspects, it has all these aspects, but that is its fundamental power. You see, the power of Islam is in the power of personal transformation. That is the power of Islam. And personal transformation leads to social transformation. That is the sunnah of Allah. You cannot create social transformation without personal transformation. That is not the sunnah of Allah. And you can find that in the Quran and in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. You see, you should do it. I mean, your first victory every day is Fajr. You see, but even higher than that is Qiyam al-Layl. But the victory over Shaitan, the first victory that begins every day is Fajr. You see, if you did not win that battle, you lost the first battle of the day. One down and several to go. That's what Shaitan says. We got him there, so everything else is going to be a little easier. But if you got up for Fajr, رَغِمَ أَنْفُ الشَّيْطَانِ, his nose is in the dust, you see, and then he's a little worried. He got up for Fajr. I'm going to have difficulty today. And that's the way it goes. So there's a personal jihad that has to take place. If that's not taking place, forget about the big battles. I mean, look at, there's a great story when the Muslims were in Egypt, and they surrounded a city there, and they were fighting, and they weren't getting any victory. And so the Amir sent out to find out, were they praying the prayers on the time, were they doing everything? And they said, the soldier came back and told him, everything's doing, they're getting up, doing night prayers, everything. The only thing they're not doing, cleaning their teeth before the prayers, because there's no siwak, right? There's no sticks. So he said, go and find some tree branches and bring them back. And so they made these, so all the Muslim soldiers started cleaning their teeth, and these Egyptians looked down from the fort, right? And they said, the Muslims sharpening their teeth, they're getting ready to eat us, right? And it created such fear in these people, they just surrendered, you know.
Okay, I'd like to go on to the next question. This is a question from the sisters. When it comes to there's Islamic courses offered at UT, and these are set out to destroy the youth at school that take the courses. It's worse for Muslim students who don't know much about the religion to begin with.
Yeah.
Can I have your opinion on how to change this?
On these courses here? Yeah. It's really dangerous to take a university course on Islam. Because most of the people teaching them are either wittingly or unwittingly undermining Islam. I mean, that's the truth. You can't learn your deen from your enemy, right? I mean, you can't. It's stupid. It's like going to somebody that would love to see you die for medical treatment, right? You know. And the result of it is Salman Rushdie. That's what you get. That's a result of getting a degree in Islamic history from Cambridge. Because that's what he did. And I think he might have even genuinely wanted to find out about his religion at one point in his life. Because he said that. I've read some interviews with him, and he went through a period where he wanted to rediscover Islam. So he decided to take courses at Cambridge, and the rest is history. Right? Because all that crap that he came up with is from medieval Orientalists that made it all up. I mean, Thomas Carlyle, who, even though Muslims constantly quote him in these books, like Heroes and Hero Worship, Thomas Carlyle, and they always take him out of context, because he says terrible things about the Prophet ﷺ, but then he also says some really nice things. So they put all the nice things that he says, right? And they don't mention all that other stuff. But one of the things Thomas Carlyle says is one of the greatest intellectual crimes is the crime of the Orientalists against Islam, because they made up all this stuff about the Prophet ﷺ, and this is what this guy read. So that's unfortunate. These people, most of them, they say we're objective, right? The university is an objective system, right? Well, the fact that the vast majority of professors in Islamic studies happen to be from a certain area of the world that doesn't really like Muslims very much is kind of unusual objectivity, right? And they definitely have political agendas a lot of times in the classes that they teach. And also, a lot of their arguments, if you're not well grounded in your deen, a lot of their arguments are very well convincing. You see, if you haven't really studied Islam in depth, they can do objectively, right? It's called what the Arabs call putting the poison in the honey, right? You see, you say what a wonderful religion Islam is, and oh, it created this great culture, and da-da-da-da, and by the way, right? And then they'll bring in the poison, you see, and they do it very subtly. So you don't realize, it's like giving the person a little bit the way the European women used to kill their husbands, is they put a little bit of hair every day in the food, right? And then they'd get these balls of hair in the stomach, and eventually die, right? So you give them a little bit at a time, right? And then by the end of the course, the person's totally confused. The way to change that, the first thing is that, I'll give you a good example. In California, there was a young, not so young, but Pakistani man whose daughter went to 7th grade. And she brought home this book that had a chapter on Islam. And it was all, the prophet was a Bedouin, camel trader, and blah, blah, blah. All this rubbish, right? And he got so angry, he started this letter-writing campaign and got all of these people to write letters. Now, I'm sure there were many Muslims that just read it and said, that's terrible, you know, and then, yeah, no, none of that's true, but they don't do anything about it. See, most Muslims, if there's fitna, they become great letter writers. I've noticed that. Like in communities, whenever there's like trouble, boom, you get these people that become the biggest activists in the world. They're calling up the phone, did you know what so-and-so did, and blah, blah, blah. And it just gets them going, right? But things about deen and about islah, about rectification and changing, everybody's an armchair Muslim, right? That's terrible, that's horrific, and we should change that. But they don't get up out of the armchair. Well, this man did. And because of that, because of his efforts, the California textbook now in 7th grade has an excellent chapter on Islam. I mean, he went to the very tops of the educational board in California, had Muslim writers come in, and they showed them how it was all incorrect information, and they changed it, you see. And that's what that person did. People have to monitor these classes. They have to monitor what's going on. People that know what they're talking about have to be in there and put pressure. You can put pressure on these people, and they should not be allowed. There's some woman teaching Islamic studies in California that was using Salman Rushdie's book as the textbook, right? And that's all based on the fact that there are not Muslims with enough ghira, what's like their jealousy for this deen or their love of this deen that makes them go out and do things, right? So that is a jihad, and it's also a da'wah. And da'wah is nothing other than jihad. There's no such thing as babu da'wah. In books of fiqh, there's no chapter called the chapter of da'wah. There's a chapter called babu jihad, and the first section on it is da'wah. So that's a jihad, to go out and change what these people are doing, because there's a lot of people out there very well funded. I mean, the Ahmadiyya are so well funded, it's unbelievable. You go all over California, in all the bookstores, and the Islamic section is filled with Ahmadiyya books representing Islam. And they're really well published and all this. Where's that money coming from? The same with the Baha'i movement, very well funded. Right? So there's funding that are going on. Muslims don't have enough ghira, right, have enough love of their religion to pull out from their pocket and start doing something about this and changing it. We certainly have the numbers and we have the intellectual capacity, but there needs to be people that get out and actually do things and change it, and it can happen. So, you know, that's a starting place. Making sure textbooks correctly reflect the Islamic teaching. I mean, textbooks like Maxine Rosenthal are unacceptable. I mean, I've seen so many comparative religion books. They'll have the chapter on Buddhism written by a Buddhist scholar. They'll have the chapter on Protestant written by a Protestant scholar, on Catholicism written by a... Then they come to the Islamic section, and it's written by, you know, some Christian or Jewish writer that has a PhD in Islamic studies. Right? That's what is objectivity. We're being objective. If a Muslim wrote it, right, it wouldn't be objective, would it, right? Well, why do you let the Buddhists write about the Buddhism? Well, because it's Buddhism. Okay. So, anyway. Oh, the green one? Which one? Many Muslim youth lead a double identity, one at home and another outside home, which does not conform to Islamic teachings. Like that's the Clark Kent syndrome. Right? Inside the home, they're mild-mannered Abdullah, and outside the home, they're super fasiq, right? So, which does not conform to Islamic teachings. How would you address this problem to bring the youth back to Islam? Well, oh, okay. Yeah, I don't find it. Anyway. Oh. Yeah. Islamic course at U of T is set out to No, this one's a different one. Oh, yeah. That's right. Sorry. Now I'm about 25,000 feet coming down. This one. Okay. Yeah, that's what Islam, you said Islam metaphorically is a house of God. Well, it's called Darul Islam. I mean, that's the traditional, and Darul Salam in the Quran. Allah calls Yad'u ila Darul Salam. Allah is, the da'wah is to the house of peace. So it's a Quranic term. And with certain mannerism, if one is not going to observe them, then they should get out. Is that not being extreme? What about people going through different degrees of practicing? Okay, I accept that as well as a criticism. Criticisms are always nice when they're put in this nice way, right? I mean, when it says, you stupid idiot, what are you telling people? You're a fundamentalist fanatic. I mean, that puts you off. But when it's done in this kind of nice, polite way, is that not being extreme? You just kind of naturally tend to accept things like that, which is nice, because that's the way criticism should be. Nice. So I accept that. But I am extreme, so you got a problem with that? You know, where I got that from, actually, I go to the prisons, right? Not as a prisoner, but as to teach people about Islam, right? And to learn, actually, because I do learn a lot there. And one of the things this Muslim prisoner told me, right? Because these guys, most of them have spent about 10 years pumping weights, and their arms are kind of bigger than both my thighs put together. And there's this picture of me with these 5 guys around me. They're all like 6'5", and I'm kind of in the middle of this thing looking like a worm or something. So one of the things they told me is that the reputation of the Muslims is so good at Soledad prison that when they have shutdowns and things like that, they actually exempt Muslims from... Guys start becoming Muslims to get the perks, right? But they'd be dealing drugs on set. Yo, salam alaikum, bro, how you doing? And then they'd be selling the drugs, right? So they were starting to get a bad reputation from these guys. So what they told me they did, this really great guy, was about 6'5" and had arms as big as my 2 thighs, said that, so I said, well, what'd you do with them? And he said, well, we just took them aside and let them know that the house has rules. And if you don't want to abide by the rules, then get out of the house. And that's what they did, right? So they kind of maintained it, and I like the idea, but it is a little extreme. So I do believe that, and I really mean this in all sincerity, particularly in this country, but really all over the Muslim world, we've had incidents, really, of young Muslims like actually throwing acid on women's legs in certain areas of the world, considering that like Amr bin Ma'ruf and Nahi an al-Munkar, right? Like enjoying, I mean, that has happened, right? Things have gotten totally out of hand, you know, and that is not the methodology of the Prophet. First of all, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Islam does not allow for vigilantism. There is no vigilantism in Islam. You cannot take the law into your own hand. That is why you cannot go out and kill Salman Rushdie. You cannot. A Muslim cannot go out and shoot Salman Rushdie. Because we have a system, a nilam. It's not fawda. If all of a sudden we just say, everybody take the law into your hand, we'll have people out there blowing people's brains out, you know, because for whatever reasons. I mean, I had somebody tell me once, I guess he learned Hanafi fiqh, and I prayed without a hat on, and he told me, next time you come in this mosque, if you pray, I'm going to tear you up or do this or that. And I was like, okay. I'll wear a hat next time, right? The last time I went to that mosque, right? So I really believe people are at different evolutionary levels. Muslim women that are wearing hijab today, 5 years ago, were not, or 2 years ago, or 2 days ago. So there is an evolution, and we have to be aware of that. As well as Muslims that were praying, some Muslims only prayed Jummah last year, and this year they're praying all 5 prayers. Some people are praying all their prayers at the end of the day when they get home from work. You know, so people are at different stages in their spiritual development, and that is something that we always have to be aware of and concerned about, right? I mean, there's Omar's method, radiallahu anhu, which is off with their heads. And the Prophet ﷺ tempered that down. You can see the transition of Omar. Abu Bakr's method, radiallahu anhu, was to kind of be gentle and forgiving for certain things. And the Prophet was the most of people that made ease for people. I mean, if you look at the man who came and he said to the Prophet ﷺ, halaktu, I've destroyed myself. And then he said, what happened? He said, I was with my wife during the day in Ramadan. So the Prophet ﷺ said, you have to make kafara, right, to expiate that. And he said, what do I do? And then he said, well, you have to feed people, right? And he said, I don't have anything to feed people with. So the Prophet had somebody go get dates from the Bayt al-Mal, and he gave the man dates, and he said, feed the people with these dates. He said, who do I feed? He said, the poor people. He said, there's nobody poorer than my family. He said, then feed your family. And he laughed. And the point is that the man had made tawbah. He was genuine in his tawbah. And so the Prophet ﷺ made it easy for him, because the point is not to be harsh. The point is to bring people back to Allah. And if you see them coming back to Allah, don't push them out. And the Prophet didn't say to him, what a wretched man you are. You did that, get out of here, get out of my face. That's not the way of the Prophet ﷺ. And a lot of people, unfortunately, are like that. So I agree with you. I was just using an extreme example, because it upsets me. When I became Muslim, the first thing I did, I read all these books, right, about the Sahaba and Umar radiallahu anhu, all these things. And then I went to, I won't name the country because it's not really fair, and I saw all these Muslims, and I was like, what? I mean, who are these people? What do they have to do with Islam and with this teaching? And to me, one of the du'as in the Quran is, رَبَّنَا لَا تَجْعَلْنَا فِتْنَةً لِلَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَا تَجْعَلْنَا فِتْنَةً لِلَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. Oh, our Lord, don't make us a fitna, right, for those who disbelieve, right? And that means don't make us like in Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? They're a fitna now, because those people that are fighting them, they're in big trouble. I mean, they're in big trouble. What they're doing to those people is a terrible thing. But it also has that, don't let us be an excuse for people not to become Muslim, which is what the Muslims are now. I mean, if you call people Islam, they say, Islam, you mean like they have in the Middle East? Right? Or I was in Pakistan, or I was in Morocco, or I was in somewhere. So it's upsetting to see that Muslims that claim to be Muslims, and then they behave the way they do. And I do it sometimes too. So, somebody once said, like making fun of people, it's a bad habit. لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم. And Allah says, be shuhada, ولو على أنفسكم. Bear witness even if it's against yourselves, right? So Muslims have to have insaf. They have to have justice, and they have to have that when they deal with people and when they deal with themselves. And so, there's one man once said that when I looked at people, I cried out to God for justice. But then when I looked at myself, I cried out for mercy, right? So it's easy to condemn everybody outside yourself. There's a beautiful hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, مَنْ قَالَ هَلَكَ النَّاسِ فَهُوَ أَهْلَكُهُم. The one that says the people are destroyed, he's the most destroyed of them. Because it's kibriya, it's like a arrogance. You look at other people and you say, they're all worthless, good for nothings. Except me, of course, right? And that's a real bad state to be in. There's a lot of Muslims fall into that state. Oh, go ahead. Bismillah.
Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
If Allah knows everything, He should...
Is this a trick question?
No.
Okay.
It could be to you.
All right, go ahead. I'm ready.
Why did He just... So everyone He knows will be bad to hell, and so does everybody to know who will be good to heaven.